And now I get to introduce, Chris Scolese. And Ed Rogers does everything right, so he gave me a piece of paper to say, this is what you say. And of course, my natural response is, I don't need a piece of paper. And then I thought, well, some of the things I probably share about Chris and working, for him for the last 10 years, maybe I'll stick to the piece of paper. But one of the things I'd say is, I've always said to Chris is that, to me, he's the finest leader, that I've worked for. And in typical NASA fashion, he wanted a metric around that. So it's a hard place to give compliments to managers or leaders because they want you to, give you precision. And so to me, the three things I look for is someone who, number one, works well and cares about people and the workforce. It sounds easy, but it's, as you know, it's not to have a leader and a manager who cares about, the people and creates an environment where people want to share and openly talk. Second is the ability to have a strategic perspective, and to me that means simply being concerned more about space and NASA than the position or the location you're at any one point of time. And that's also very difficult because we all get pulled into having to fight for our own kind of thing, and it goes in different directions. But Chris has always had a brilliant strategic perspective, and so every conversation, it always gives me a different kind of a view. And more than a few times he reminded me, okay, let's look at it from a NASA standpoint as opposed to maybe an Apple or some of the things we're trying to do. And then third, the ability to work in a technical organization around science and engineering and all the different disciplines and be able to have the respect, because the professionals here, the discipline experts who come from so many different areas, respect the knowledge and the interest and the expertise. And so, to me, this is the fortune that you have with Chris as the Center Director of Goddard Space Flight Center. And in terms of some of the words, he's the director of the Goddard Space Flight Center and was appointed on March 5th, 2012. Still a very black day in the Hoffman household. Got to be straight about that. He also served as the NASA Associate Administrator for our agency, and was a wonderful Associate Administrator for the different reasons I kind of laid out. Was the NASA Chief Engineer for a number of years, and has received, it looks like, every award. I didn't even know NASA and the country had this many awards. And you'd be bored if I read through all of these. So let me just say he's won just about every award except, I think, an Emmy and an Oscar. And his acting and singing isn't that good, so you don't have to worry about that. But anyway, it's a pleasure to introduce Chris Scolese.
Thanks, Ed, for that introduction. It's kind of hard to follow up now. But I do want to welcome everybody and say good morning to everybody that's here at Wallops IV&V and around the agency that's participating in this workshop. It's something that, as you've heard, and I certainly believe, is very important. And it's kind of a strange title when you think about it, talking about organizational silence. There's an oxymoron in there. We're talking about silence. And, as Ed Hoffman said about Ed Rogers, he prepares you well, and he found a quote that I think captures it really well about silence. And it comes from Paul Simon. As you can imagine, it would have to come from somebody that thinks about these things and is poetic. But he pointed out very accurately, silence like a cancer grows. And that's, true in all walks of what we do. When you think about NASA, when you think about spaceflight, and you recognize the complexities, really recognize the complexities, because we live with it every day, and we can't escape those issues that come up. It's not easy to get a satellite built. It's not easy to get an instrument built. It's not easy to get a rocket off the ground. If we don't communicate, if we don't break the silence, we won't be successful. And think about how difficult it is to do that. There may not even be any restrictions. Think about when you were new, first out of college, and you're sitting in a room, you now have a lot of knowledge, a lot of great knowledge, in fact. You know things that the experienced people sitting next to you don't, because you've had the latest and greatest of what's going on. Yet you're sitting with people, some of whom may be the superstars of of NASA or you've heard about. You're probably a little reluctant to speak up in those situations, or just in your normal, day-to-day life when you're sitting there. I always recall the first day I became a manager and they took my engineer card away from me. And you get that door, or you get that cubicle, or you have to wear a tie every day. All of a sudden, the people that you used to talk to all the time and would say, whatever, gee, we ought to think about doing this, or, isn't the center director an idiot? They don't talk to you anymore. That's another form of silence that goes out there. And then, of course, there's the silence that happens because, you're intimidated, whether it's actual intimidation by a supervisor, or it's perceived intimidation just because of the personality of the individual. You may not speak up. So how do we get around that? Well, one is we do things like this, and we have the conversation and talk about effective ways to do it. The other way is we provide a structure to allow people to communicate. It's something that I believe all high-performing organizations do. NASA is a high-performing organization. Ron could go through the latest round of things, and NASA once again, and Goddard Space Flight Center once again, and Stennis are at the top of innovation. Well, we're not innovators if we don't communicate, if we don't break the silence. So what are some of the things we have? We have the dissenting opinion process. You're allowed to go to, you sit in a meeting, you're allowed to go to your supervisor, you're allowed to go to the chief engineer, to the chief safety mission assurance, wherever, to go off and explain why you have a concern and why that concern is important to whatever the issue is that you want to bring up. That's just one way of going off and addressing it. We have the safety reporting system is another way to go off and address it. You have your normal peer-to-peer communications where you can have that conversation. And of course, we have, as Ed mentioned earlier, we have the Ombuds program to go off and bring those things up. And we have ADR. We have many, many ways of going off and doing it. The best is to bring it up at the time that it's relevant. But of course, we recognize personalities play into it, just natural shyness. But we have to break that silence. We can't afford to, as Paul Simon says, to let silence become a cancer that prevents us from being successful, prevents you from being successful. Let's see, Ed also told me I had to go quicker. So I'm skipping over stuff. But today is this is the third, I believe, session that we've had on organizational silence, and I'm encouraging you to really participate. It's going to be different this time, as I know in the past. There were more speakers. This time there's going to be a lot more time for interaction. There's only 2 speakers today. They're great speakers. You're going to hear some very interesting things about how silence is bad and how to break the silence, and how breaking it has resulted in great success for not just NASA missions. When you hear Andy Chaikin later this afternoon talking about Apollo and the historical aspects of things, it'll be a great talk to give you some sense of what's going on there. You'll hear from Marcia Coleman Adebayo as soon as I'm done here, who will talk about a more serious form of silence and how that was dealt with. And then there'll be several panel sessions with many of the people that you know, and I would strongly encourage you to participate in all of those. Break the silence, ask the questions. You can do it anonymously, but you can also do it not anonymously. And I would strongly encourage you to have that dialogue. So in closing, I'd like again to say how important communication is to our success and to your success. And maybe a little bit as an aside, many of you know, my background is in engineering, is in electrical engineering, and in graduate school, my minor was in communications. That was my technical minor. Not at all like what Ed and Ed talk about with communications. Mine had a lot of equations and EIRPs and coding theory and everything else. But one of the things that, and many of you have that same thing, but one of the things that I relate to it, and as Ed talks, Ed Hoffman mentioned earlier, we spoke a lot, and I've asked him for a lot of help in helping me to communicate better and to listen better. And that's the important thing about communication. It's two ways. You have to communicate, and there has to be a receiver. There has to be a transmitter and a receiver. And just like in communication theory, there's noise in the system at all times. It's either the noise that you have with your preconceived notions. I hear what you're saying maybe differently than the way you're saying it. Orlando Figueroa once said to a former center director, "I didn't hear what you meant to say." And that's part of what we have to go off and do. So just like in technical communications, we have to get over the noise as well as having the transmitter and the receiver working together. So with that, I'm going to step down. And again, thank you for your participation. I hope to participate as much as I can today because this is really important. But you'll see me coming in and out as we go through the day.